December 1944. The Ardennes forest groaned under the weight of snow. The air was sharp, the silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant thud of artillery. For the German soldiers moving west, this was supposed to be their moment of redemption. Hitler had promised them that the Reich still had one last victory left, one strike that would turn back the tide of war. They believed the Ardennes would become the graveyard of American hopes. But something unexpected was about to happen. The first shells came screaming overhead. The Germans dropped into the snow, confident the ground would shield them from the blast. For years, this was the rule of survival. Artillery killed only if you stood too tall or too close. Then the impossible happened. A shell detonated in the air, above them, not on the ground. Shards of steel sliced downward like rain from hell, shredding men who thought they were safe in their foxholes. Another burst followed and another. Confusion ripped through the German line. This wasn't normal artillery. This wasn't physics as they understood it. Soldiers shouted rumors, invisible mines, cursed munitions, witchcraft. They didn't know the truth, that the Americans had armed their shells with one of the most closely guarded inventions of the war, the proximity fuse. It was no bigger than a flashlight bulb, but it could sense its target. It knew when it was close enough to unleash maximum destruction. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. For the Americans, it was a miracle. The Ardennes offensive was supposed to be Hitler's last gamble. Instead, it would become the proving ground for a device so secret, U.S. commanders had orders to kill their own men rather than let one fall into enemy hands. That winter, the Reich's dream of splitting the Allies in two collided head-on with a piece of technology that detonated not just shells, but Germany's final illusions of victory. Adolf Hitler sat in his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden in late 1944, staring at maps littered with colored pins. Every general around him knew the truth. The Reich was collapsing. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and now stood on Germany's western doorstep. To the east, the Soviets were driving relentlessly toward Berlin. German factories lay in ruins, rail lines were shredded, oil fields were burning, but Hitler refused to accept defeat. He pointed to the Ardennes forest, the same rugged terrain his armies had used in 1940 to surprise France. To him, it looked like destiny repeating itself. The Allies thought the Ardennes was a quiet sector, a place for exhausted divisions to rest. Hitler saw it as a blind spot, a weak seam in the Allied front. The plan he unveiled was audacious, reckless, and almost delusional. Over 400,000 German troops would strike through the Ardennes in a surprise winter offensive. They would punch a hole through American lines, seize the Belgian port of Antwerp, and split the British from the Americans. If it worked, the Allies would be thrown into chaos, forced to negotiate, and Germany would have time to turn east and stop the Red Army. It was to be a Blitzkrieg reborn, but it was a gamble stacked against reality. The German army no longer had the resources of 1940. Fuel shortages plagued their tanks. Many soldiers were teenagers or men dragged back from convalescent hospitals. Their Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Still, Hitler believed. And when Hitler believed, men obeyed. On December 16, 1944, the storm began. At 5:30 a.m., 900 German artillery pieces opened fire across the Ardennes. The barrage shattered the stillness, lighting up the winter sky. Entire American positions were obliterated before soldiers even knew they were under attack. The snow, the fog, and the sheer force of the German advance created panic along the thin U.S. defenses. American commanders scrambled. It looked like a repeat of France in 1940, the enemy breaking through where no one thought they could. Roads jammed with retreating vehicles. Small towns fell, German tanks pushed forward, their crews confident they would soon see the English Channel again. Yet even in those first days, cracks began to show. Fuel trucks broke down, bridges collapsed under the weight of German armor, and everywhere the Wehrmacht advanced, their supply lines stretched thinner. They didn't know it yet, but they were marching into a battlefield where American science had hidden an invisible trap, one that would detonate above their heads at the worst possible moment. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and with it, the slow unveiling of the fuse that shattered Germany's last hope. The Americans stationed in the Ardennes called it a ghost front. Compared to Normandy or the Siegfried Line, this sector was quiet, almost too quiet. Soldiers rotated here to rest, patch wounds, and gather strength for the push into Germany. On the night of December 15th, many of them wrote letters home. Some played cards in dimly lit basements, joking about how lucky they were to be away from the heavy fighting. Snow fell thick and steady outside, cloaking the forest in silence. Then the ground shook. At dawn on December 16th, German artillery roared to life. Shell after shell screamed across the skies, shattering trees, tearing open frozen roads, and collapsing dugouts. Men who had thought they were in a safe zone suddenly found themselves buried in snow and splintered timber. Private Harold Johnson of the 106th Infantry remembered the moment. He had been sipping bitter coffee when the first salvo hit. It was like the whole earth cracked open, he recalled years later. We thought it was just another harassing barrage. Then it never stopped. Thousands of German shells poured down. The sky turned into a thunderous curtain of explosions. In the white fog, American outposts were swallowed before anyone could react. Communication lines snapped. Radios went dead. And then came the tanks. Out of the mist, dark shapes rolled forward. Panthers, Tigers, armored half-tracks carrying battle-hardened SS troops. Entire American platoons were overrun in minutes. Small towns like Clairvaux and St. Vith became infernos of fire and steel. The Americans were stunned. They hadn't expected a major German offensive in this sector, especially not in the dead of winter. Many thought the Germans were too broken, too weak to mount anything like this. They were wrong. The German gamble had caught them off guard. Soldiers who had been relaxing one moment were suddenly fighting for their lives. Some units fought back desperately, others were surrounded, and some simply surrendered when they realized escape was impossible. But amid the chaos, something began to shift. In the skies, American gunners prepared weapons the Germans had never faced before. Artillerymen set their sights, not on the tanks but on the columns of infantry moving through open fields. They loaded shells that looked ordinary but carried within them a secret. Each contained a proximity fuse, technology that would detonate the moment it sensed it was close to its target. As the Germans pressed forward, believing surprise had secured them victory, the first of those shells was fired, and what happened next would spread fear through the Wehrmacht in ways bullets and bombs never had. The German columns pushed forward through the snow, boots crunching in unison. Officers barked orders. Confidence rippled through the ranks. They had smashed the American front wide open. Towns were falling, prisoners streaming back. Some soldiers even joked that they would be in Paris again by spring. Then the shells came. At first, the Germans weren't alarmed. Artillery was part of war. The whistle of incoming fire was familiar, almost routine. Men dropped to the ground, trusting their trenches, ditches, and foxholes to protect them. That was how it always worked. Hug the earth, let the blast pass overhead. But this time the earth didn't protect them. A shell burst in the sky, high above, just low enough to rain death directly onto the men below. Shrapnel tore through helmets, flesh, and frozen soil. Screams echoed across the snow. Soldiers who thought they were safe were shredded in the open. Another shell followed. And another. The air itself seemed to explode. Shards whistled downward at impossible angles. Men in cover were hit as though the sky had betrayed them. Panic spread. Veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front swore they had never seen anything like it. One German corporal shouted that the Allies must have planted invisible mines in the air. Another muttered that the shells carried black magic. Superstition grew faster than explanations. All they knew was that foxholes, the one place of safety every soldier trusted, were now death traps. What the Germans didn't realize was that these were no ordinary shells. Inside each one was a tiny device, no bigger than a flashlight bulb, packed with radio waves and a miniature vacuum tube. The fuse could sense when it was near a target. Instead of waiting to hit the ground, it detonated at the perfect moment. maximizing the killing radius. For the Americans, it was a game changer. They no longer had to guess the range precisely or rely on fuses that often failed. The shell itself decided when to explode. That meant German infantry advancing in tight columns could be devastated before they even reached U.S. lines. For the Germans, it felt like the rules of war had been rewritten. In the Ardennes, proximity-fused shells began to carve holes in the advancing formations. Soldiers who once believed in Hitler's promise of victory now felt an unease creeping through the snow. Some looked upward every time they heard a whistle, as if the sky itself had turned into the enemy. The Battle of the Bulge had begun with confidence on the German side, but with every airburst, the seed of fear spread wider, and whispers of an American miracle weapon began to echo through the frozen forest. And this was only the beginning. Years before the Ardennes exploded in fire, scientists in America and Britain had been racing against time. Everyone knew that technology, not just manpower, would decide the war. Radar had already changed the skies. The Manhattan Project was building something even more terrifying in the desert. But in secret laboratories, another project was underway, one so small it could fit in the palm of a hand, yet powerful enough to alter the battlefield forever. The proximity fuse. Until then, anti-aircraft fire had been notoriously unreliable. Gunners sprayed the skies with thousands of shells, hoping one might get close enough to damage an enemy plane. Most missed. Soldiers called it skywriting. The waste was enormous, the results pitiful. What if a shell could explode not on contact but when it sensed it was near a target? The concept had been toyed with for years, but engineers dismissed it as impossible. The device would have to survive the brutal forces of being fired from a cannon, 20,000 times the pull of gravity, enough to crush fragile electronics instantly. Worse, it had to be tiny, cheap, and reliable in freezing cold or sweltering heat. Yet by 1942, American scientists had cracked it. Using miniature vacuum tubes, they built a fuse that emitted radio waves. When the waves bounced back from a nearby object, the fuse knew it was close. Instantly, it triggered the explosion. The shell became smart, almost alive. The military called it a variable time fuse, or VT fuse. Soldiers simply called it the miracle bullet. The secret was guarded with near-paranoid intensity. Every fuse was counted. Commanders gave explicit orders. If one risked capture, it had to be destroyed, even if that meant shooting your own men. The fear was simple. If Germany or Japan got hold of the design, the advantage would vanish overnight. At first, the fuses were used against aircraft, and the results were staggering. Japanese pilots diving toward U.S. warships in the Pacific suddenly found themselves blasted from the sky by shells that didn't miss. Admiral Lewis Strauss, later head of the Atomic Energy Commission, said the proximity fuse was second only to the atomic bomb in importance for ending the war. But the Ardennes would be its deadliest stage. For here, the fuses weren't just turning the skies against enemy planes, they were turning the very air above the battlefield into a weapon against German troops. As German officers tried to rally their men, reports trickled in. Entire squads wiped out by a single shell. Men shredded in trenches they thought were safe. The usual rules, cover, concealment, survival, were dissolving. Hitler had bet everything on his last gamble. But inside the snowbound forests, his men were being cut down not by overwhelming numbers, not by tanks, not by planes, but by invisible radio waves packed into a device smaller than a matchbox. The Germans didn't know it yet, but they weren't just fighting the Americans anymore. They were fighting science itself. The Ardennes in December was a world of misery. Snow buried everything. Trees bent under ice. Roads turned into rivers of frozen mud. Soldiers on both sides shivered in wool coats that did little against the cutting wind. Some men froze to death in their foxholes before bullets ever found them. Yet in the middle of this frozen hell stood Bastogne. The small Belgian town sat at a crossroads of 7 major roads the Germans needed to feed, their advance toward Antwerp. If Bastogne fell, German tanks could surge deeper. If it held, the entire offensive would choke. The Germans threw division after division at the town, encircling it, hammering it with artillery, starving it of supplies. Inside, elements of the 101st Airborne, the 10th Armored Division, and scattered survivors of shattered units dug in. They were outnumbered 5-1. It should have been hopeless, but hopelessness doesn't account for innovation. The Americans had something the Germans didn't understand: proximity-fused shells. Every time German infantry massed for an assault, U.S. gunners unleashed airbursts that exploded directly above them. The snowy fields outside Bastogne became killing grounds. German soldiers, expecting to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers, found themselves cut down before they even reached the American lines. Corporal Robert Stiles later recalled, "We watched them come through the fog, hundreds at a time. Then the shells started bursting in the air. It was like the hand of God reaching down. Whole groups just disappeared. The effect was psychological as much as physical. German troops no longer trusted their own foxholes. They didn't dare cluster together. Every open advance felt like walking beneath an invisible net, waiting to be torn apart. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the men clung to every shell they had. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition dwindled. Food was rationed to crumbs. But the proximity fuse gave them confidence that each shot counted for 10. When German commanders demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe issued his now famous one-word reply, "Nuts." The defiance rattled the Germans. They had expected panic. Instead, the Americans stood unbroken, armed not just with courage but with science. In the blizzards that followed, the fuse turned Bastogne into a fortress. German assaults melted under airbursts. And while the defenders froze, starved, and bled, they held the crossroads. Bastogne didn't fall. And in that stubborn stand, the Germans lost the momentum they so desperately needed. The Ardennes was becoming less a story of surprise and more a story of attrition. And every day, the fuse tilted the balance further against Hitler's gamble. By late December, the Ardennes offensive was already losing its sharp edge. The initial shock had carried the Germans far, but now every mile seemed to cost them dearly. Fuel shortages forced tanks to sit idle in the snow. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and everywhere they advanced, U.S. artillery followed them with uncanny precision. But what unnerved German soldiers most was the new kind of shell. At first, they thought it was bad luck. Maybe the Americans had gotten lucky with their ranging. Maybe the bursts were timed just right. But the pattern kept repeating, shells exploding above their heads, shredding squads before they could dive for cover. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front whispered that this was worse than anything the Soviets had unleashed. Some claimed the Americans had filled the air with invisible mines. Others swore they had invented a kind of sky radar that guided shells like predators. The effect on morale was devastating. Soldiers no longer trusted their own instincts. They hesitated to mass together even when ordered. Convoys bunched too closely were obliterated in seconds. Platoons told to dig in found that foxholes were no longer protection, but open graves. Letters captured from German troops told the same story. One soldier wrote home, "The Americans have a weapon that finds us even in our holes. We are no longer safe from the sky. Men are afraid to stand near one another." Commanders tried to keep discipline, but fear spreads faster than orders. Officers barked threats, demanded obedience, but when the shells rained down from above, authority crumbled with the snow. Meanwhile, American gunners grinned grimly as they watched the results. For once, their fire didn't feel like guesswork. They could see the terror it created, the way German units broke apart under the invisible hand of the fuse. What the Germans didn't know, and what made it worse, was that the weapon wasn't everywhere. Only select artillery units had been equipped with proximity fuses. But perception mattered more than numbers. To the men on the ground, it felt as though every American shell was guided by some unseen intelligence. The rumors reached higher command. Reports filtered to Berlin that American artillery had developed detonators that explode in the air. Hitler dismissed them at first, calling them exaggerated, defeatist talk. But as the Ardennes offensive stalled, Even he had to wonder whether the Allies had pulled another miracle from their laboratories. For the ordinary German soldier freezing in the snow, the answer didn't matter. The belief was enough. The sky itself had become the enemy, and every shell whistle was a death sentence. And in war, belief can break an army faster than bullets. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The reports from the Ardennes at first looked grim. Eisenhower's staff watched maps fill with red arrows, showing German spearheads driving deeper into Belgium. Town after town was overrun, American divisions were shattered, and panic rippled through the rear areas. Some officers feared another Dunkirk in the making, but Eisenhower was calm. He had seen enough war to know that panic was a weapon, and he refused to hand it to the enemy. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he told his generals. The Germans had stretched themselves thin. If the Allies could hold their ground, reinforcements and logistics would turn the tide. Still, the question remained: how to buy time? That's when Eisenhower's artillery chiefs reminded him of the secret they had kept buried for months: the proximity fuse. It had already proven devastating against aircraft in the Pacific. Now, for the first time, it was being used on European soil against ground forces. The reports were extraordinary. Small numbers of shells were breaking up entire German battalions. Infantry formations that should have swarmed American lines were scattered in minutes. Even in the chaos of retreat, U.S. gunners could inflict massive losses. Eisenhower recognized its value immediately. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a psychological equalizer. German soldiers believed they had the momentum, the numbers, the surprise. But the fuse stripped them of confidence. Suddenly, foxholes were useless. Open ground was suicide. And the very air above their heads turned hostile. He quietly ordered that the weapon be deployed wherever possible, but reminded commanders of the secrecy. If the Germans recovered even a single intact fuse, the advantage could vanish. The technology was still fragile, still experimental. Yet, in the desperate cold of the Ardennes, it was exactly the edge the Allies needed. General Omar Bradley later admitted, "The proximity fuse was one of the most important developments of the war. In the Bulge, it saved countless American lives, and Eisenhower knew it. Every time proximity shells tore through German formations, they were more than explosions. They were signals, to both sides, that the tide was shifting. For the Americans, it meant survival. For the Germans, it meant their last gamble was being dismantled piece by piece, from the sky down, and as fresh U.S. divisions rushed into the Ardennes, the secret weapon gave them the breathing space they needed. The fuse had tipped the balance. For days, the Ardennes had been cloaked in fog, sleet, and snow. German commanders had counted on it. The bad weather kept Allied planes grounded, giving their panzers freedom to move without fear of strafing runs. Every gray morning felt like a blessing to the Wehrmacht, a shield from the sky. But weather is a fickle ally. On December 23rd, the skies broke open. Clouds thinned, sunlight spilled across the white forests, and for the first time since the offensive began, the roar of Allied aircraft filled the air. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. P-47. Thunderbolts swooped low over roads clogged with fuel trucks and tanks. Bombers rained destruction on bridges and supply columns. C-47 transports dropped supplies into Bastogne, strengthening the desperate defenders. What had been a confident advance just days before now turned into a struggle for survival under the relentless assault from above. And on the ground, American artillery added its own storm. With the proximity fuse, their shells detonated not just near aircraft but over German infantry. Soldiers who thought they had escaped the planes found themselves shredded by invisible bursts from above. A convoy could be strafed from the sky, then finished by airburst shells the moment survivors regrouped. One German survivor described it bitterly. "The Americans attacked from the clouds and from the earth. Now, even the air above our helmets was against us. The combination was devastating. Tanks stalled for lack of fuel were picked off. Troops who tried to regroup in forests were scattered by artillery that seemed to know exactly where they hid. Villages turned into traps, pummeled from the air, then shredded by shells that burst over rooftops. American commanders seized the moment. General George S. Patton, racing north with his Third Army, drove his men relentlessly into the Ardennes. His advance collided with German spearheads that were already reeling under airstrikes and artillery barrages. Patton's men fought with fury, but they also fought with confidence. Word spread quickly about the new fuses. Infantry cheered every time airburst shells ripped through German assaults. Morale soared in frozen foxholes. For once, the men felt that science itself was fighting alongside them. The Germans, meanwhile, began to falter. Officers could no longer rally their men with speeches about destiny or victory. The reality was too stark. Every road was under watch, every open field a death trap, every shell whistle a reminder that even survival instincts were useless. The weather had turned, and with it the tide of the battle. The Ardennes, once the stage for Hitler's last gamble, was becoming a slaughterhouse for the Wehrmacht. And the proximity fuse, invisible yet merciless, was tightening the noose. The German offensive had started like a thunderclap, fast, brutal, unstoppable. But by the final week of December, the thunder was fading. What was meant to be a lightning strike toward Antwerp was slowing to a crawl in the frozen woods of Belgium. The reason was simple: fuel, time, and the fuse. German tanks were designed for speed, but without gasoline they became steel coffins stranded on icy roads. Panther crews sat freezing inside their machines, waiting for supplies that never came. Columns clogged the narrow Ardennes lanes, some abandoned, some burning, others waiting helplessly for a miracle that wasn't coming. Above them, the skies that had once sheltered them under snow and fog now betrayed them. Allied planes prowled the roads, shredding convoys with rockets and bombs. And when the planes weren't there, the artillery was. The proximity fuse had turned American guns into executioners. In the past, German infantry had been trained to survive bombardment. Drop into a trench, press against the earth, wait it out. But now, shells didn't wait to hit the ground. They burst in the air, sending steel downward in a cone of death. Soldiers were torn apart even in cover. Foxholes became graves. One German officer wrote later, "It was as if the air itself had learned to kill us." This new reality shattered the very doctrine of Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg depended on concentration, tanks, infantry, and artillery all striking in massive, overwhelming waves. But with proximity fuses, concentration was suicide. Every time the Germans tried to mass for a push, they were shredded before the attack began. The strategy that had once conquered Poland, France, and the Low Countries was now useless in the Ardennes, and Bastogne remained the bleeding wound at the center of it all. Hitler had promised the town would fall quickly, opening the road to Antwerp. Instead, the 101st Airborne and battered American units clung to it like a fortress. Every failed German assault cost precious fuel, men, and morale. By December 27th, the Great Red Bulge on Allied maps no longer looked like a spearhead. It looked like a blister ready to burst. Reinforcements were pouring in from the north and south. Patton's Third Army was driving hard into the German flank. The last gamble of the Reich was unraveling, and for the German soldiers shivering in the snow, the realization sank in with every whistling shell. They were no longer fighting just American soldiers. They were fighting American science, an enemy that didn't miss, didn't tire, and made even the air above their helmets a weapon. While German troops fought desperately to keep their offensive alive, one man was already moving faster than anyone expected: George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army had been holding position further south when the Ardennes erupted. Eisenhower asked how long it would take for Patton to turn his army north to relieve Bastogne. Most generals would have said a week, maybe 10 days. Patton said he could do it in 2, and then he did. In blizzards, across icy roads, with tanks sliding on frozen mud, and soldiers marching through waist-deep snow, Patton's men pivoted north like a steel hammer swinging into the German flank. They sang Christmas carols as they marched, their voices raw in the freezing air. For them, Bastogne wasn't just another town. It was proof that the Americans could never be broken. The Germans knew Patton's reputation. He was relentless, ruthless, a man who would drive his men to the edge of collapse if it meant victory. And now his army was coming straight at them. As Patton's advance closed in, the proximity fuse continued its merciless work. German units caught between the Third Army and Bastogne found themselves under constant bombardment. They couldn't mass for defense, they couldn't retreat in order, and every cluster of men became a target. The result was chaos. Columns dissolved into scattered groups. Tanks tried to turn back, only to run out of fuel or be destroyed by Allied aircraft. Soldiers who had marched west full of confidence were now trudging east in retreat, leaving behind broken armor and frozen corpses in the snow. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne heard the distant rumble of Patton's guns. Supplies had been running out. Ammunition was scarce and the men were surviving on frozen scraps of bread. But they refused to yield. When German shells fell on the town, they cursed and dug deeper. When German officers demanded surrender, they laughed. And then, on December 26th, the siege was broken. Patton's spearhead smashed through to Bastogne, linking up with the exhausted but defiant defenders. The Germans had lost the crossroads forever. The bulge on the map was shrinking fast. For Hitler, the news was catastrophic. His armies had thrown everything into the Ardennes, hoping for one decisive blow. Instead, they were bleeding men and machines they could never replace. The Allies weren't splitting apart. They were tightening their grip. And at the heart of that grip was the weapon no German strategist had anticipated: the proximity fuse. Everywhere Patton advanced, American gunners used it to tear apart counterattacks before they even formed. Every attempt to stall the Third Army collapsed under invisible explosions from above. The Germans weren't just losing ground. They were losing faith. The counterpunch had begun, and it would not stop until the Reich itself was broken. By the final days of December, maps in Allied headquarters told the story more clearly than words ever could. What had once been a sharp red bulge thrust deep into Belgium was shrinking, its edges crushed inward from every side. The great German spearhead, designed to split the Allies apart, was bending under relentless counterblows. Patton's Third Army hammered from the south. Fresh divisions poured in from the north, and at the center, Bastogne still stood, bleeding but unbroken, its defenders now supplied from the air and reinforced by Patton's men. The German dream of reaching Antwerp was over. Now the question was not how far they could advance, but how many would escape. And with every step of their retreat, the proximity fuse haunted them. Columns of infantry attempting to withdraw through open fields were shredded by airbursts. Bridges they tried to secure collapsed under Allied artillery fire. Even in forests, the shells seemed to find them, bursting above the trees and raining down steel. Soldiers described the sound as different from anything they had known: a sharp crack in the sky, followed by a storm of whistling fragments. For men who had lived by the rule of the foxhole, it was unbearable. Cover no longer meant safety. Retreat no longer meant survival. In one desperate counterattack near New Year's Eve, German panzer grenadiers massed for a push to reopen their supply routes. They moved quickly, hoping to overwhelm thin American lines. Instead, proximity-fused artillery detonated above them in precise waves. Survivors recalled the snow turning black with smoke, then red with blood. The attack dissolved before it even reached the front. The generals knew the truth. The offensive had failed. Fuel was gone, reserves were gone, and the last chance for Germany to alter the war in the West had been spent. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overseeing the battle, told Hitler bluntly, "This is the end of the offensive." But Hitler refused to admit defeat. From his headquarters he demanded fresh attacks, reinforcements, miracles. None came. His armies were bleeding out in the snow, trapped between Allied planes above, American artillery on the ground, and the invisible death of the fuse. By mid-January, the Ardennes looked nothing like a triumph. It looked like a graveyard. Burned-out tanks lined the roads. Frozen corpses lay scattered in ditches. Villages were nothing but rubble and smoke. The bulge had cracked, and with it, the last real hope of Nazi Germany. In Berlin, the news from the Ardennes arrived in fragments. Bulletins written in cautious language, reports that tried to soften the blow. But even the most carefully worded updates could not hide the truth. The great winter offensive, the last gamble of the Reich, was unraveling. Hitler's rage was volcanic. He had promised his people that this strike would split the Allies, force negotiations, and give Germany the breathing room it desperately needed. Instead, the advance had stalled in the snow, and the Allies were closing in from all directions. Around the map tables, generals exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what the Führer refused to admit. The Reich had gambled everything, and lost. But Hitler would not hear it. He raged at his commanders, accusing them of cowardice, incompetence, even betrayal. He demanded fresh attacks, reinforcements that did not exist, and miracles that would never come. The men around him listened in silence, understanding that logic no longer lived in their leader's mind. Behind the rage lay despair. Germany had bled itself dry. The fuel poured into the Ardennes was gone forever. The men lost in the forests of Belgium could not be replaced. The tanks abandoned in snowdrifts would never be rebuilt. And perhaps most alarming to the generals was the technology they had witnessed on the battlefield. Reports from the front confirmed it. The Americans had a new type of shell, one that detonated in the air, rendering foxholes and cover useless. Entire units had been cut down before they even saw the enemy. For the first time, German commanders admitted quietly to one another that the Allies had leapt ahead in science. Blitzkrieg had once been their weapon of surprise. Speed, innovation, and shock. Now it was the Americans who wielded those tools: radar, long-range bombers, atomic research, and now the proximity fuse. The balance of power was no longer military. It was technological. The Ardennes had been Hitler's final chance to turn the war in the West. Its failure left no illusions. The Reich could no longer win, only delay defeat. As German soldiers limped back across the ruined forests, Hitler ordered investigations, purges, even executions of officers he believed had failed him. But the real failure was not tactical. It was strategic. The world had moved forward, and Germany could not keep pace. The reckoning was clear. The Battle of the Bulge had shattered not just armies, but faith. Faith in Hitler's promises. Faith in victory. Faith that Germany's future could still be saved. The Ardennes was over. Berlin was next. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. The snow had stopped falling, but the landscape was scarred. Trees splintered into jagged stumps, roads lined with burned-out tanks, villages reduced to smoldering rubble. The once proud German columns that had surged forward in December were now scattered wrecks littering the frozen ground. American patrols picked their way carefully through the ruins. They moved past panthers and tigers abandoned on roadsides, their tracks frozen stiff, their turrets blasted open. Inside, crews lay still, frozen in place, snow drifting over lifeless bodies. In the forests, the silence was overwhelming. No birds sang, no animals stirred. Only the crunch of boots and the hiss of wind. Beneath the snow, thousands of corpses lay unburied. American, German, civilian, grim reminders of the price of Hitler's gamble. For survivors, the memory was worse than the sight. Men on both sides would later speak of the unnatural horror of airbursts, the shells that did not strike the ground but split open the sky. Soldiers described the way snow turned red in an instant, how the sound of steel fragments cutting through branches was as terrifying as the screams that followed. Many never forgot the fear of looking upward, knowing death could come from above without warning. An American infantryman wrote in his diary, "It felt like the air itself was against them. The Germans weren't fighting us anymore. They were fighting something they couldn't see, couldn't beat." German survivors who limped home told darker tales. Some spoke of ghost shells, others of sky mines. One described it as the work of demons. The proximity fuse, unknown to them by name, had become a legend whispered with dread, and the cost was staggering. The Germans had lost more than 100,000 men in the Ardennes, killed, wounded, or captured. They had burned through tanks and fuel they could never replace. Their Luftwaffe, already crippled, was shattered further. The Wehrmacht had poured its last strength into the snow and received nothing but death in return. The Americans, too, had paid a terrible price. Tens of thousands lay buried beneath white crosses, their sacrifice etched into the frozen soil. But for the Allies, the Ardennes was not the beginning of the end. It was the confirmation of it. The fuse had given them an edge that magnified their will to endure. In the Ardennes forest, silence returned, but it was not peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, of death, of the knowledge that the war was not yet over, though its ending was now certain. When the snow cleared from the Ardennes, the world knew that Hitler's gamble had failed. Newspapers carried stories of the German defeat, of Bastogne, of Patton's counterpunch. But there was one detail left out, one story deliberately hidden: the proximity fuse. To the men who had fired the shells, it was no mystery. They had seen the devastation, heard the screams, and watched the German lines shatter under invisible bursts. To them, the fuse was as real as the rifles they carried. Yet, outside the battlefield, almost no one knew it existed. The reason was simple: secrecy. American and British commanders considered the proximity fuse so valuable that its existence was guarded as tightly as the Manhattan Project. Every fuse was counted, every shell tracked. If a shell failed to detonate, patrols were sent to recover it before the enemy could study it. Soldiers were told explicitly, if there is a risk of capture, destroy the fuses, even if it means destroying your own position. The fear was not paranoia. If the Germans had captured a working fuse and reverse-engineered it, the balance might have shifted. Proximity detonation could have devastated Allied bombers, crippled their infantry, and blunted their offensives. The weapon was a sword in Allied hands, but in enemy hands. It would have been a spear aimed back at them. So it stayed hidden in plain sight. Official communique credited American artillery skill, or superior fire, discipline. Generals praised the bravery of the men and the efficiency of the guns. But the word fuse never appeared. Even soldiers who had fired the rounds often didn't know how they worked, only that they worked, and they kept working. After the Bulge, the fuses were used with ruthless efficiency as the Allies crossed the Rhine, smashed into the German heartland, and pushed toward Berlin. Each time, the airbursts tore through defenders, making every village and forest another graveyard for the Wehrmacht. Only later, when the war ended, did the full story begin to surface. Historians would rank the proximity fuse alongside radar and the atomic bomb as one of the three inventions that had won the war. Admiral Lewis Strauss himself declared, "The proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. Without it, we might have lost." But in the winter of 1944, no soldier needed a speech to understand its power. They had seen the sky itself turned into a weapon. And for the Germans, the memory of those bursts, those shells that seemed to think, never left. It was a secret that killed in silence, and stayed silent even in victory. Wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by belief that survival is possible, that victory is attainable, that the enemy can be beaten. In the Ardennes, the proximity fuse did more than shred German columns. It shifted belief. For the Americans, December 1944 had begun with shock. German panzers had smashed through their lines, entire divisions had collapsed, and for days it seemed as though the Allies were on the verge of another disaster like Dunkirk. In frozen foxholes, men whispered doubts. Could the war drag on for years? Could Germany still turn the tide? Then the airbursts began. Infantrymen watched as German attacks dissolved under shells that burst in the sky. They saw the fear spread through enemy ranks. And for the first time in weeks, they felt not just hope, but certainty. Their artillery wasn't just holding the line, it was untouchable, unstoppable. The fuse became a quiet source of confidence. Soldiers who had been clinging to life in the snow suddenly believed they had the upper hand again. They joked that the sky itself was fighting for them. In letters home, some called it God's fuse. This mattered more than statistics. Because while technology gave the Americans an edge, it was the belief in that edge that stiffened their resolve. Bastogne didn't hold simply because of shells. It held because men believed they could endure. Patton's march didn't succeed only because of tanks. It succeeded because his soldiers believed the Germans could no longer stop them. For the Germans, The effect was the mirror opposite. They had begun the offensive with high spirits, believing they were on the verge of one last triumph. But when their foxholes betrayed them, when every shell overhead seemed to know their position, that faith shattered. Confidence gave way to superstition. Soldiers muttered about devil weapons and sky mines. Officers struggled to rally units that no longer trusted in tactics or terrain. Blitzkrieg had once been built on morale as much as speed. The shock of seeing German armor slice through defenses, the psychological collapse that followed. In the Ardennes, that formula reversed. The shock was theirs. The collapse was theirs. The fuse had done what no speech or strategy could do. It had broken the spirit of an army. And in that winter forest, belief became the deciding factor. The Americans believed they could not be beaten. The Germans no longer believed they could win. From that moment forward, the war in the West was no longer about if the Allies would triumph, but when. The Ardennes ended in Allied triumph, but no one who fought there called it easy. For the men in the frozen forests, victory had been carved out of suffering. The proximity fuse had saved lives, had broken attacks, had shortened the battle. But it could not erase the price. By January 1945, more than 80,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing. Entire companies were erased from the rosters. In the first days of the offensive, Green divisions like the 106th Infantry had been crushed under the German onslaught. Towns were captured and retaken so many times that bodies of friend and foe alike were frozen together in the same rubble. At Bastogne, the defenders endured weeks of siege, short of food, medicine, and ammunition. Soldiers there remembered eating frozen horsemeat scraped from carcasses in the snow. Frostbite crippled as many men as bullets. Survivors spoke of the hunger, the cold, and the constant shelling that made every hour a test of endurance. The 101st Airborne, forever linked with Bastogne, paid dearly for their fame. Hundreds of paratroopers never left the Ardennes. Those who did carried scars, some physical, many invisible, for the rest of their lives. Civilians suffered too. Belgian villages became battlegrounds, their homes reduced to rubble, their families caught in the crossfire. Thousands fled into the freezing forests with nothing but what they could carry, only to find themselves trapped between armies. And the Germans. Their losses were even greater. More than 100,000 casualties, thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed, and fuel supplies spent that could never be replaced. Yet among the survivors, bitterness lingered, not just at defeat, but at the sense that they had been beaten by something unnatural, something beyond their understanding. For both sides, the Ardennes was a crucible. American veterans would later say it was the hardest battle they ever fought, harder than Normandy, harder than the push into Germany. It was the cold, the shock, the relentlessness of it all. Even with the miracle of the fuse, men still had to fight hand-to-hand in snow-choked villages, still had to march through nights where the temperature dropped so low rifles froze in their hands. The fuse had changed the balance, but it hadn't made victory painless. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest battle the U.S. Army ever fought. It broke the Wehrmacht in the West, bled Germany of its last reserves, and opened the road to Berlin. But for every man who walked out of the Ardennes alive, there were memories that never thawed. Victory had come, but it had come at a price paid in frozen blood. The Battle of the Bulge was remembered for its snow, for its brutality, for the courage of men who refused to surrender. But beneath the human story was another truth. By 1944, World War II was no longer just a clash of soldiers. It was a clash of scientists. The proximity fuse was proof of that. It was not a rifle or a tank or even a plane. It was an idea that radio waves, shrunk into a device no bigger than a flashlight bulb, could turn a dumb shell into a thinking weapon. That idea changed everything, and it wasn't alone. Radar had already transformed the skies, giving Britain the edge during the Battle of Britain and guiding Allied bombers deep into Germany. The breaking of the Enigma code had turned German secrets into Allied intelligence, allowing convoys to evade U-boat wolf packs. Penicillin, mass-produced for the first time, saved tens of thousands of wounded soldiers who might otherwise have died of infection. And looming in the background was the Manhattan Project, a weapon so powerful it promised to end wars forever. Each invention carried the same lesson. The future of war would belong not only to the bravest soldiers, but to the sharpest minds. The Germans had once understood this. Blitzkrieg itself had been a kind of scientific innovation, combining tanks, planes, and radios into a single doctrine of speed and shock. But by 1944, Germany was outpaced. Their scientists were still brilliant, but their resources were gone. Bombed factories, crippled supply lines, and Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket drained what strength they had left. The Allies, meanwhile, had harnessed the full weight of their economies and their laboratories. The proximity fuse was a symbol of that unity. American engineers, British physicists, and soldiers on the front lines had together created something that tipped the scales of battle. In the Ardennes, that science saved lives. Every German attack broken by airbursts meant fewer Americans lost in desperate close combat. Every shattered column meant fewer panzers breaking through villages. The fuse turned survival from chance into certainty. For the Germans, the realization was devastating. They were not just losing a battle, they were losing the race of ideas. One captured officer reportedly muttered, "We are fighting not just men, but the minds of entire nations." He was right. The Ardennes was the last great battle Germany would launch in the West. It was also the battle that proved once and for all that science had become the decisive weapon of war. And from that moment on, no soldier in the Ardennes doubted that the future of battle would be decided not only in trenches or skies, but in laboratories and mines. When the smoke cleared from the Ardennes, the German army was shattered but not yet destroyed. Hitler still demanded resistance. Villages were fortified, rivers defended, bridges blown apart in desperate attempts to slow the Allied advance. But the truth was clear. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength to launch major offensives. From January 1945 onward, the war in the West was a relentless push east, straight toward the heart of Germany, and the proximity fuse marched with the Allies every step of the way. Artillery remained the backbone of the advance. Wherever German units tried to regroup, the fuse punished them. Airbursts over retreating columns scattered survivors into chaos. In forests and towns, the fuses made cover unreliable, breaking up counterattacks before they could gather momentum. At the Rhine, where the Allies prepared for the massive crossing into Germany, the fuse again proved decisive. German defenders tried to mass along the riverbanks, hoping to repel the assault. Instead, artillery tore through them with timed detonations that exploded over trenches and strongpoints. Crossing the river was still costly, but the fuse cut down resistance so brutally that defenses collapsed faster than even planners expected. German soldiers spoke of it with dread. By now, many had learned its name, Sünder mit Annäherungssünder, the proximity fuse. But knowing the name gave no comfort. They understood what it meant. There was no safety anymore. Not in holes, not under trees, not even when the ground itself should have shielded them. For the Allies, the fuse became routine. No longer a mystery, but a trusted companion. Gunners loaded shells with quiet confidence, knowing they were firing a weapon that would find its mark. Infantry cheered whenever they saw enemy attacks disintegrate under invisible bursts. For men who had once been forced into desperate hand-to-hand fighting, the fuse was salvation. By April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin from the west and the Soviets advanced from the east, Germany was collapsing. Its armies retreated without fuel, its cities lay in ruins, and its soldiers fought with the grim knowledge that the war was lost. The proximity fuse had not won the war by itself. No single weapon could. But in the Ardennes, at the Rhine, and in the villages of Germany, it had made the difference between holding the line and breaking. Between survival and disaster. One U.S. general later said, "The atomic bomb ended the war. The proximity fuse won it." And for the men who had crouched in foxholes in December 1944, staring upward at shells that burst in the sky, there was no doubt. The fuse had followed them from fear to triumph. The weapon that had turned the tide in the Ardennes would carry them to the gates of Berlin. In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. What Hitler had once promised as a 1,000-year empire now measured its life in weeks. Allied armies closed in from the west, the Red Army from the east. Cities that had once celebrated conquest were now smoking ruins under constant bombardment. Yet, in the ruins of Berlin, Hitler still clung to illusions. He ranted about wonder weapons, about divisions that no longer existed, about victory that would never come. To his shrinking circle of followers he spoke of destiny, of history bending to his will. But outside those walls, reality was undeniable. The Ardennes had been his last gamble. It had cost Germany men, tanks, and fuel it could never replace. It had proven that the Wehrmacht no longer commanded the skies, the roads, or even the safety of the earth beneath its soldiers. And it had revealed to the world that the Allies now fought not just with numbers, but with science. The proximity fuse had shattered more than German units. It had shattered faith. Faith that the Blitzkrieg could still work. Faith that Foxholes could still protect. Faith that the Reich could still win. Every burst in the Ardennes was not just steel tearing flesh, it was an illusion being ripped apart. By April, Allied shells armed with proximity fuses rained down on German defenders outside Berlin. They burst above streets and barricades, breaking formations before they could mount resistance. For the men on the ground, the fear was the same as in the Ardennes. The sky itself had turned into an enemy. When Berlin finally fell, it was not just the end of a battle, but the end of an idea that Germany could outfight, outlast, or outwit its enemies. Science, strategy, and sheer endurance had combined to grind the Reich into dust. For the Americans who had crouched in foxholes during that terrible December of 1944, the memory never faded. They remembered the shock of the German offensive, the hunger and cold, the fear of collapse. And they remembered the moment the airbursts began, when despair gave way to belief, when survival became victory. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last throw of the dice. The proximity fuse had been the invisible hand that knocked those dice from the table, and in the silence that followed, the last illusion of German victory shattered forever.